Hey everyone, welcome to my first segment of the course on teaching that moves people, which will be focused on introspective practice as the foundation for a teaching practice, or as one of the foundations for a teaching practice. I want to do a brief introduction about myself to let you know a little bit about who I am and what I do, but I'll keep it very short because I think most of you are familiar already with who I am and what I do. Over the years, I've accumulated probably more than 10,000 hours in teaching between being in the physical workshop setting with students and the one-on-one coaching setting. So I'll be using my experience in both of these areas to guide you through this course and to hopefully give you some concrete tools that you can apply directly to your own teaching practice. Okay, so I want to get straight to the meat of it. What is narrative excavation practice and why is it relevant to your teaching skill set? The second term is easiest, so I can start there. Excavation is fairly self-explanatory. It means taking something from under the ground and bringing it up to the surface. Some place where it was not seen to some place that it is seen. Narrative is maybe a little more ambiguous, so I'll take some time to explain what I mean by narrative. Let me use a concrete example to demonstrate what I mean. I want you to go and fill up a container with water. It can be a cup, it can be a water bottle like this, anything that can hold water that you can drink out of. Just go, fill it up, pause the video now, and then come back with a full container of water. Okay, so you've got your water. I want you to place it down near you within reaching distance. And then when you let go of the bottle or the cup or whatever you filled with water, I want you to imagine that you've never touched this object before, that you didn't just go fill it up with water, just for the sake of this exercise. Now imagine you're going to reach for the container, and really imagine it, like picture you're actually going to reach out in space and pick up the container. If it has a lid, you'll unscrew the lid. If it doesn't, you'll just bring it up to your mouth and take a sip. So I want you to imagine the scenario, but don't do it. Okay, now that you've visualized the action, I want you to think back on that visualization and list out all of the things that you might have assumed about the container itself, or about your body, or about the action of picking up the container and taking a sip. Now I want you to write down that list of assumptions or guesses that you made about either your body, how it moves in space, the object itself, etc., etc. So write down that list of assumptions or guesses and pause the video now, and then I'll come back and give you some examples of my own assumptions and guesses. So one thing I imagined was how much it might weigh based on how much liquid was in the canteen. And so weight is one thing. Also, what the nature of the substance is inside. I had to make a guess about that since, remember, I've never seen the object before. So how much liquid is inside it? If it is liquid at all. Is it empty? Second, what's the texture like? So the outside of the container, what does it feel like? How much force might it take to unscrew the lid? As I reach out and pick it up, I also have to imagine how much strength, or I have to make a guess about how much strength I have in my arm and whether or not I can support the object. I have to imagine how much liquid is inside. If I tilt it, the nature of the weight changes based on how much liquid is inside. So there are a number of things that I'm actually guessing or assuming about the bottle before I ever even touch it or pick it up. I'm trying to anticipate or make guesses about the way the object is, about the way I am, and about the way I move in space and interact with the object. As I was listing off those things, did any more things come to mind that you were sort of anticipating or guessing or calculating as you visualized yourself reaching out for the canteen or container and taking a drink? My point here is that the way I'm using this concept narrative is more or less all-encompassing. It refers to the software, more or less, that's running on our brains. As we interpret ourselves, we imagine how we are, and we interpret objects and how they move through space, how the object is, and how its actions are, and how we're going to interact with that object as it moves through space. So the term object here is very loose. So object can mean another person, can also refer to a relationship, etc., etc. So we ourselves, the acting subject, and everything else that's happening, and the objects outside of us as the objects upon which we act. So as we walk around and live our lives, we're more or less sort of swimming through or looking through this matrix of narrative that we're telling ourselves and telling ourselves about the way the world is and about the objects that surround us, about the way they're moving in space. and how we're going to interact with that environment. That's the nature of narrative. And without this sort of software of narrative that's running on our brains constantly, it would be very hard to imagine even navigating our environment and staying alive from moment to moment. Just imagine for a moment that you couldn't make any such calculations. You couldn't make anticipations or guesses about how things would be in the future, about how objects would move, or you couldn't form any assumptions about yourself and what you're capable of. Imagine how hard it would really be to live from moment to moment in a life like that. It would be, I think, nearly impossible, if not impossible. We would be like newborn infants, incapable of making decisions from moment to moment and from navigating space from moment to moment and across time. Okay, so how does this relate to the narrative excavation practice? Because admittedly, the purpose of the narrative excavation practice is not to excavate or become aware of every single narrative that we ever tell ourselves at any point in time. That would be quite cumbersome and more or less impractical. So this practice of narrative excavation is focused on one very specific element of narrative, and that is the narratives that we tell ourselves about ourselves in response to what I call traumatic events. What is a traumatic event? Trauma, I think, is an experience that we have in response to an event that is characterized by emotions of. We'll talk more about core emotions and why it's important to have a concept of core emotions as we move forward in the narrative excavation practice. Here's another concrete example that will hopefully make my point clearer. Concrete, but imaginary. So imagine there's a woman named Jane. Jane has a boyfriend. Jane and her boyfriend are going to a party. So during the party, Jane and her boyfriend come together, they go apart, they talk to other people, they come back together again, they see each other at various points through the party. During one point in the party, Jane looks over at her boyfriend and notices, let's say, Jane and James. So James is talking to a woman that he's never met before, seemingly never met, and they're having what looks like an engaging conversation sort of off to the side of the room. The party goes on, they both move on to talk to other people and talk to each other and reconvene and split apart and reconvene and split apart. Okay, so the party's over, they drive home together in the car. As they're driving home together in the car, Jane is talking to her boyfriend and she notices something seems off about him. So she asks him about it, and through the course of the conversation, James says that he ended up taking a liking to the girl in the corner. Not only this, but he liked her so much that he wants to leave Jane and that he thinks he wants to go try a relationship with this other girl. So let's say that's the end of the story. And you can imagine that Jane, in this case, would have some reaction to this event, right? It would be probably safe to assume she would have one of the emotions that I listed. And in response to this emotion, she would no doubt tell herself a narrative about herself, or a narrative about the way the world is, or about the way other people are, or about the way James is, which inevitably traces back to a decision that she's making about herself. Now, in the end, we're not Jane, so we can only speculate here, and in the end, Jane is also an imaginary person, so we also have to speculate in that regard. But the point here is that in response to this event, Jane would almost inevitably tell herself a story about herself or a narrative about the way she is. And some examples of that might be something like, maybe I'm not interesting enough to hold James' attention. Maybe I'm ugly, or James doesn't like me enough because I'm too shy, or maybe I'm too outgoing. Or maybe James is a superficial person who actually doesn't care about deep connection in a relationship and is only attracted to physical appearances. And this girl was more attractive than I am, so that's why James likes her. So in any case, we can imagine all these sort of potential narratives that would be swirling around in Jane's head. And then whatever narrative Jane settles on about herself, whether it's I'm bad because I'm stupid, lonely, ugly, not interesting, boring, or maybe it's something is wrong with James, right? Maybe he's untrustworthy or superficial or just a mean bastard, right? So in that case, if James is that way, maybe more than James is that way. Maybe all men are that way, or many men are that way, or at least James is that way. And so at least around James, maybe around men in general, maybe around many people in general, Jane's not safe, doesn't feel safe, right? Or maybe she feels disconnected from James's motives. She doesn't feel she knew him or knew where he was coming from. She tells herself a story. I'm not connected to James. I don't really know him as well as I thought I was. Maybe I don't know anyone as well as I thought I did. Maybe I'm not connected to anyone as well as I thought I was. Therefore, I'm alone. So these are the three primary narratives that everybody is cycling through more or less all the time. I'm alone, I'm not safe, and I'm bad. And these forms take a different shape depending on the situation and depending on the individual and what experiences they've gone through. But the point is, whatever narrative that Jane settles on at that time and she decides is true, she's going to then carry into the future to try to navigate future scenarios. So whether she decides that she's bad in some way, not safe in some way, or alone in some way, she's going to then use that narrative to interpret future situations under that lens. And very much like the water bottle, basically what Jane is doing is she's trying to make assumptions about the way she is, about the way objects are or other people are, and about the way she interacts with objects or other people or her environment, so that she can better predict how things will go and how to navigate her environment. Now, my point here is not that people are water bottles. My point here is that as far as the brain is concerned, they're very much alike. It's just that people are kind of like very complex water bottles with moving pieces. And as I move through my life, I'm continually forming narratives about what I perceive as this water bottle, this subject who is acting in space and an environment on other water bottles. Kind of a strange metaphor, but I think you get my point. Okay, so the question is, why is this relevant to you as a teacher or a leader or someone who is taking somebody else, facilitating them through practice? The fundamental insight of this practice is that most people, most of the time, are walking around in this cloud of narrative, telling themselves stories about themselves and about the way the world is, about how they should interact with the world. That's inevitable. That's necessary. But the fundamental insight of this practice is that most people are doing this without being aware that they're doing it. There's no separation between themselves and the narrative. For them, the narrative is just the reality. It's just how things are. Well, I'm just a shy person. I'm just a bad test taker. Or I'm the kind of outgoing person that is always the class clown. Or I tend to make good public speeches. Or I'm not a good public speaker. I'm too thin. I'm fat. For most people, this is just the reality that they're walking around with from moment to moment and day to day. They're not aware that there can be any separation or space between themselves and the narrative that they're telling themselves about themselves. So the process of narrative excavation is extremely essential for teachers and everybody else because it allows us to create space between the narratives that we're telling ourselves about the way things are and the events or the actual facts that are occurring. So as teachers, we're no exception to this practice, right? We're continually making assumptions about ourselves and we're bringing those assumptions into our teaching practice and into our teaching environment. We're making assumptions and guesses about the way other people are, about the way our environment is, and about how we should interact with other people in our environment. This is our narrative. This is the software that we're running on our brains that in some ways enables us to navigate our reality and also to function from moment to moment. But in other ways, it comes with side effects and it comes with baggage, especially when the narratives that we're telling ourselves about ourselves were formed in response to traumatic events, and now we're carrying those narratives into our moment-to-moment and day-to-day interactions and teaching. As I look around at teaching culture and observe individual teachers, one thing that's become obvious to me is that the fundamental aspect that's lacking or preventing people from reaching their full potential as teachers is introspection in this regard. Most teachers are walking around like the average person day to day, not really aware of the narratives they're telling themselves about themselves and how that's influencing their moment-to-moment experience, their self-perception, their professional lives, their career decisions, their general decisions about their life from moment to moment, their perception of their clients and students, and how they're interacting. For example, when you all contributed to the question on the Facebook platform, what do you think that your weakest point is as a teacher. I'll give you some examples of things that you answered. I would say my biggest weakness is my lack of confidence and my tendency to tone down my passion when faced with a client who seems less than enthusiastic or resistant to taking full responsibility for themselves and their actions. I know this lack of confidence is stopping me from fully exploring and developing my ideas. My biggest weakness as a teacher is most likely the fact that I'm quite wordy in my explanations. I'm insecure about my capacity to efficiently get my point across. One weakness that does seem to come up regularly is my inability to be patient and kind, empathy perhaps. I've always been a bit extra, so my personal experience revolves around not making excuses for shit. So I think I mismanage students when they come to me with these reasons, whether valid or not. So far, I have considered myself more of a listener than a speaker. However, I'm determined to improve my weakness. I do believe it has something to do with me having too high expectations of myself before giving myself time to do the work and actually having a fighting chance. I can get pretty frustrated with myself when someone doesn't seem to get what I'm trying to explain clearly. Not sure if you feel frustrated too, or how to deal with it. I grew up with Russian gymnastics coaches and ballet teachers screaming at me about the right way to do things, the right way. I do see how those environments contributed to form the narratives that exist in my head, i.e., I'm not good enough. But I struggle with those who do not take the modifications or are too hard on themselves and don't stick with it. The ones who aren't fully involved, checking the clock constantly, and that you can tell they want to be out of the room as soon as they can. So it's interesting because all of these are issues about how we're talking to ourselves about ourselves, or how we're talking to ourselves about our students, how we're perceiving and relating to our students. And so I think this makes it obvious that for many people, the weakest point in their teaching, or where they could stand to grow the most, is to bring introspective awareness to the narratives that they're telling themselves about themselves and how that's influencing the way they interact with their clients. This practice can help create space to consider what's possible on the other side of giving up our attachment to these narratives. But before we can give up our attachment to the narratives, first we have to make it very clear and obvious consistently that they are in fact narratives, and that we are in fact telling ourselves these narratives and choosing to tell ourselves these narratives over time, which sounds simple, but actually it's a very involved practice, and it takes consistent, systematic application. So I want to give you some very clear tools and foundational aspects that will help you to move into a consistent practice of not only identifying what narratives you're telling yourselves, but also identifying how those narratives are influencing your self-perception, your decisions from moment to moment, and your perception of other people and your environment. My aim in this section of the course is not to tell you what to think, or to tell you what to think about yourself, or to tell you how to teach. My aim is instead to bring awareness or observational skill to how you are already talking to yourself about yourself, and how you already think about yourself, and how you already think. This will hopefully create space for you to become more intentional about the tools that you're using and how you're stepping on your own feet in the process of reaching your full potential as a teacher.